Let's pray. Amen. Welcome back, everybody. We're continuing to look at the history of the Millerites so that we can glean some information about the events that are going to occur in the time period in which we're living. So we've already discussed the issue about the time of the end, and we've seen how 1798 lines up with the year 1989. And the time of the end for the Millerites, 1798, becomes the time of the end for us, the final generation. And we saw that the principle that the Millerites were using was the principle of time. Specifically, 1 day equals 1 year, or what we would call prophetic time. We saw that this was the arrival of the first angel's message in agreement with Ellen White. The book of Daniel has been unsealed, and that unsealing of the book of Daniel was in relation to time. There were many people before this time period that were preaching the everlasting gospel or the soon coming of Jesus, but nobody had any information, correct information, about the location of when this event was going to happen. Then William Miller, through his studies, through angels guiding his mind, begins to realize and understand that this event, these prophecies, we looked at only 3 of them in our previous study, the 7 times, Leviticus 26, the 2300 days of Daniel chapter 8, and the 1335 of Daniel chapter 9, were all going to be fulfilled in this history here. Many people didn't believe him. He started off very small, an independent speaker. But by the time we get to the year 1840, specifically August 11th, one of the associates of William Miller, Josiah Litch, he predicts, using the same rules, the same methodology that William Miller has used, that radical Islam here is going to be restrained. And he actually predicts the date. So here we have the restraining of radical Islam. And he develops his theory from the book of Revelation, chapter 9. And he predicts that radical Islam, Egypt, in this time period, is going to be restrained on the 11th of August, and it happens as his prediction foretold. And when that happened, there was a great impetus in the movement. Many infidels, many backsliders returned back to the churches. And the churches were really happy about the great work that Miller and his associates were doing for them. There was a great revival in the churches, and this started off these last 4 years where things began well and gradually got worse and worse for the Millerites and also for the Protestant churches. So we've marked here the time of the end, the increase of light or increase of knowledge, which I've identified as IK, increase of knowledge, and we saw that the message had been formalized. It was packaged in a way that many people could understand, and it could be printed and people could read what William Miller's message was all about. And he gave a consistent message from this moment right through the end of that history. And we've seen how these events are paralleling the events that are occurring at the end of the world in the time period in which we're living. We've already marked 1989 as the time of the end, and we saw that the year 1996, when we had a magazine or a booklet which was titled The Time of the End and dealt with the last 6 chapters of Daniel 11 verses 40 to 45, was dealing with the subject of the soon coming Sunday law. And then we saw how the events surrounding 9/11 parallel the events of 1840. The verse that we looked at for 1840 was Luke chapter 21, verse 25. The distress of nations, the political strife that's occurring in the year 1840, and which was paralleling the events that are occurring in our history, year 2001, where the nations begin to become angry at the activities of radical Islam. And this is found in Revelation chapter 11, verse 18. We read those verses together yesterday. And so we've come in our history from the arrival of the first angel's message to its empowerment. And the reason we mark the arrival and the empowerment of these messages is because here, this empowerment is being used to symbolize that whatever the message was brought to view here has now been proven to be true. So the message that William Miller was predicting all the way down here was proved to be correct in the year 1840. And in these last 4 years, many, many events were occurring. And this is what we're predicting today. We began to see that 1989 was a fulfillment of prophecy, Daniel 11 verse 40, which has already been discussed. And then a few short years later, at 9/11, we had a confirmation that history was indeed repeating. And this message that we teach is all based around the premise that history repeats, not in a vague way, but in a very specific and detailed fashion. And we could go to many stories in the scriptures. In fact, all the Bible is dealing with the events at the end of the world. Our problem is we're unfamiliar with many of these truths, so we don't understand many of these Bible passages in the way we're required to. Most people, when they read scripture, only read them at a moralistic level or an individual level, so we can take some counsel from many, many different passages in the Bible. If you were thinking the book of Psalms, if we were thinking the book of Proverbs, every one of us reads those books almost as devotionals, and we take personal solace in the instruction that the Lord's given us in those books. But our contention is that even those books that we read that speak about an individual or a personal walk are really dealing with prophetic subjects. And if we understood the coded language that's being brought to view in these verses and chapters, the whole Bible would begin to open and we'd have much more clarity about the final events that are occurring. But even today, through the Lord's providence, through the guiding of the Holy Spirit, there are many books that were apparently close to us that we didn't have very good understanding about. They've all begun to be opened, and in particular the books of Daniel and Revelation. There are many, many passages in those books that are now have been opened to us that we can now apply in a very specific way about the events that are occurring at the end of the world. And the methodology that we're using is the same methodology that William Miller used. We follow his rules, and perhaps the primary one is dealing with symbology, or figures as he would call them, and how they're supposed to be used, how they're applied, and also this premise that if you don't understand the portion of scripture in one place, you go to another portion of scripture to understand what is being discussed. And we use the term of proof texting to encapsulate that theory or that idea. And so that's what we're doing. We're just looking at Millerite history because it's a very detailed history, and many, many of these events are prefiguring the events that we're talking about at the end of the world. But we could have gone to another story. We could have gone to the story of Christ, and we could have lined up many events that are occurring there. We could have gone to the book of Esther. Indeed, we could have gone straight into the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation. We could have gone into the book of Chronicles or Kings. Many, many books we can look into, and we can see the tracing of prophetic history that are detailing in a very specific way the events that are now happening. So we've arrived at 9/11 as we're paralleling these histories, and we want to see how we're going to move forward. So we're back here. Now, once this message had been empowered and many people were joining, this movement, the Millerite movement, began to be established, and we've already mentioned it's the formalization of this message. Now, if we can use the phraseology that we've already spoken about, this temple or this movement began to be constructed or began to be built. And you know that Paul says that when you want to build a temple, you have to lay it upon a sure foundation. So they began a foundational work that would be the basis on which this movement would be built. So right here after 1840, they began a foundation work. And this foundation was the bedrock upon which this message was based. As this foundation is being built, and this foundation is nothing more than the truths that the Millerites, William Miller and his associates, were developing and refining and understanding and sharing with the masses. And it got to a stage, by the time you get to the month of May 1842, this foundation was set and ready and firm. And it was portrayed in a chart, or what the Millerites would call a table. And this chart here, the 1843 chart that we call, was the foundation of the faith of the Millerites. Ellen White speaks about this chart in this fashion. She talks about it in a number of different ways, but she says the truths that were the foundation of this message were all encapsulated in this 1843 chart, and this chart should not be changed. It should have been a guide and a help and an assistant to God's people. Now you and I know, we've already mentioned this, that it's called the 1843 chart because the focus of attention was the year 1843, but you can see we've got 1844 strewn at the back end of this line. And most of us hopefully are familiar with the story about the mistake that was on this chart. Ellen White talks about it as a singular mistake, and they make a mistake in the way they calculate their timing. All the methodology is correct, the start or the commencement dates are all correct, but they make a mistake in the last or the end portion of these time prophecies, and they end up being a year short. By the time they get to this event here, April the 19th, and onward in these last few months of the year 1844, they realize the mistake and they correct this mistake. A few short years later, in fact 6 years later, back here in the year 1850, a second chart is produced here that's on my right. This chart was produced in the year 1850, and it does a number of things. The first thing it does, it corrects this calculation from 1843 to 1844. So you can see here that it has all the same commencement dates, 677, 457, 508, all of those three commencement dates that we spoke about, but it corrects it all the way down here and it terminates it in the year 1844. So we know that before 1850, in the year 1846, and indeed in the year 1844, the Millerites begin to understand two things. First of all, in the year 1844, they understand what the sanctuary is. You know, they'd made a mistake. They thought that the sanctuary was the earth, and now they realize that the sanctuary is actually the heavenly sanctuary, and it's dealing with Christ's ministration. So they correct that mistake. And the second mistake that they made in this history, or they were oblivious to, the issue of the Sabbath. So the issue of the Sabbath and the issue of the sanctuary are all corrected along with the year 1844 instead of 1843, and all that information is encoded or embedded in the messages here. So here you can see this is the sanctuary model they're corrected and they've understood. And here hopefully you can see Revelation 14 verses 9 to 13, which is the third angel's message, which is dealing with the Sabbath issue. So they made these corrections, but both of these charts are virtually that have the same information on it, except for those adjustments. Now if we turn to Habakkuk chapter 2, I'm sure many of us are familiar that when these charts, or as the Millerites would call them, these tables were developed, that they based the development on these charts from a Bible passage that they found in the book of Habakkuk. This is from Habakkuk chapter 2. It's between Zephaniah and Nahum, if you're looking for Habakkuk. It's a bit awkward to find sometimes. So you go to Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, and you eventually get to Habakkuk. So we're in Habakkuk chapter 2, and we're going to read from verse 2. Habakkuk 2:2, it says, "And the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it." So this vision that's brought to view in Habakkuk chapter 2 are the prophecies that we've been dealing with. The 7 times, the 2300 day prophecy, and the 1335. In fact, it's all the major time prophecies that are on these charts. This is the vision, and it's used this term in the singular because the Lord wanted to really make a point that the Millerites actually didn't realize, but we've now understood in much greater clarity why the Lord uses the words, the vision in the singular and not in the plural. Because William Miller talks about the prophecies in the plural, but here it's talking about the vision in the singular. And it says to write this vision and make it plain upon tables. So you can see that first they produced this first table here, and then the second table was produced here. So there are these 2 tables, and I mentioned before that these 2 tables are symbolic of the covenant that the Lord enters into with his people, which are the antitypical fulfillment of the 2 tables that are brought to view in Exodus chapter 20, which have the 10 commandments on them. They serve the same purpose. They're the basis of the covenant, because these are the foundational truths upon which Adventism was founded. So here we have 1843. This is the foundation of the Millerite movement, the messages that they begin to teach. Now, up to this date, up to the year 1843, William Miller and those who were preaching with him were rather vague upon when the fulfillment of these prophecies was going to be. He would say something along the lines when he would present, maybe, in my opinion, I think the Lord is going to appear somewhere around the year 1843. And with all that vagueness, people didn't feel threatened. But when they produced this chart, and this chart began to speak for itself, you can see it doesn't have maybe or perhaps or around. It has precise dates that are easy to see. There's 1843, 43, 43, 40. There's 1843 all over this chart. And people began to be perturbed about the information that this chart was trying to teach. And so there is a backlash that begins based upon the information that's on this chart. And the next month, in June of 1842, the Protestant leaders, the pastors, the conference structure of these Protestant churches began to resist the messages that the Millerites were teaching. And it got to a position where they began to close the door or refused access to the Millerites into the churches. And then began a wave of disfellowshipping. Disfellowshipping began after June 1842, and it was initiated by the information on this chart. So here we have this chart, and there's a cause and effect relationship. So this is the cause, of the problem and there's an effect. And the cause was, I'll put in this scenario, it was time. So there was a problem on this chart that was in relation to time, and the effect was punishment. Now we're going to come back to this chart and how it's going to be applied or used in our history in a moment. But I've already brought to view that here there was this second chart that was made. Ellen White has a lot to say about this chart, and this is the 1850 chart. As I said, both of these charts have almost the same information on it, but there's a correction and the addition of the sanctuary and the addition of Sabbath keeping, all encoded in this chart. What we didn't speak about yesterday when we addressed the year 1863. Do you remember we spoke about the year 1863? And in the year 1863 there was a general conference. The church was given a name. This is the Civil War that's in the United States, the Battle of Gettysburg. And I mentioned that at that general conference, one of the things that was voted and put into effect was that they would now begin to reject the 2520. And what they did to make sure that that would be promulgated through the church, they developed another chart. And this is what's termed today as the 1863 chart. It was produced, designed and published by James White. And on this chart it has many of the information that's on these charts, but with some differences. First of all, one of the differences is that there's no writing on those charts. You needed a little handbook to explain all the information on the chart. So that was one subtle difference, but the fundamental difference was that between the 43 to 50 and the 1863 chart was that there was no 2520. They had rejected this, and almost the express purpose of producing this chart was to take out the 2520. And so this becomes a subject of Bible prophecy, and we've spoken about this, that the rejection of the 2520 becomes a symbol of the rejection of the covenant that the Lord is wanting to enter into with his people. And he enters into covenant with his people here in 1850, and only a few short years later, 13 years, they have rejected the covenant and they go into darkness. And pretty much this church has been in a progressive darkness since that time period. I was speaking to one of my sisters yesterday, and she was talking about some of the history back in the 50s, the 60s, 70s, going into the 80s, where you can pinpoint key conferences, key documents that have been written trying to identify the problem that's in the church and how they've been suppressed, people have been punished, people have been silenced. This is a recurring theme in our church, unfortunately. And this period of darkness, or as William Miller would call it, this scattering, has been occurring for 126 years. We described that in the previous presentation, from 1863 all the way to the year 1989. And from 1989, now history is repeating, and we spoke about these 46 years where the Lord wants to rebuild a temple, and he's going to deal with the sin problem in this church. From 1989, we've now entered into a reform movement, which is the reform movement of the final generation, and it's going to culminate here at the very end. So we can put that in here, at the very end of this movement, with the Sunday law in the United States, which all of us are familiar with. And in this process, from 1989 to the Sunday law, the Lord's going to rebuild a temple, which we often call the remnant, or the 144,000, or the final generation. We identify this group with various symbols. Another one that we use sometimes is the church triumphant. You've all heard of that phrase, the church triumphant. Today, we're in the church militant. So the church militant, the definition of the church militant He's not someone who's angry or who militates against Christ, but the church militant is describing a church that has got good people and bad people in it. Or as the Bible talks, the wheat and the tares, the wise and the foolish, the good fish and the wicked fish. There are various parables that describe the condition of our church, and this is the condition of the church today. There are many wheat and tares all together, and Matthew 13 teaches us that we're supposed to not disturb these two groups or try to separate them one from another, but they're supposed to be allowed to grow together until the harvest. Hopefully you're familiar with Matthew 13 when it talks about that, and the harvest is going to be addressed here at the Sunday Law. At the Sunday Law, this is where the harvest happens, and these two groups are going to separate, and we're going to have the church triumphant, which is going to be composed of only wheat, those people who are faithful and true. So this darkness, this apostasy that the church went into is going to begin to be addressed from the year 1989 as the Lord tries to restore us back to the purity of our former days. But as always, only a remnant are going to be saved. There are very few people who are going to accept this truth, relatively speaking. We're at 9/11 and we've paralleled 1840. We've discussed the chart here, and a few short years after 1850, actually in the year 1856, the discussion of the 25-20 became another interesting topic. Do you remember here, Hiram Edson, the person who walked through a cornfield, who had a vision of Christ in the most holy place? He began to study the issue of the 25-20, and he came to a conclusion that there was another stream or another truth, additional light on the 25-20 that the Millerites had missed. And we spoke about this, if you recall, in one of our previous presentations, where this prophecy that William Miller was discussing from the year 677 to the year 1844, he understood it in a different way. And he understood it to be the year 723 to the year 1798. And so today we understand that both of these lines of truth are correct. There's this stream of 25-20 and another stream of the 25-20, and we've discussed this at length in one of our previous presentations. So these two charts here, which were the foundation of the Millerite movement, now become present truth for us today. Around the year 2005, we already knew about the information on this chart, and that there was this 25-20 that was brought to view here, and we knew about the same 25-20 that's brought to view here. It brings the date 677. The 7 times of Leviticus 26 takes you to 1844. So the information is the same on both of these charts. And long before 2005, we understood about the 25-20, but we had only seen this one here, which is brought to view on these charts. And we might call this Miller's 25-20, because this is the truth that was developed by William Miller, 677 to 1844. Now, as I say, around the year 2005, through studies, a brother who was in this movement, he was looking at some Review and Herald articles, and he came across a study that Hiram Edson had done, which was saying or challenging William Miller's understanding of the 25-20. So here's 677, 1844, and he said, in his opinion, Hiram Edson said this, that the 25-20 actually began in the year 723 and 1798. Very quickly we began to realize that both men were correct. Miller and Edson were both correct about their understanding of the 25-20. And so today, in our generation, around the year 2005, these charts really became a focus of attention. So here we have the year, or the chart 43 and 50. These two charts became present truth in our history. And just in the Millerite history, when it was the foundation of their message, it became the foundation of our message. So you can see that we're paralleling Millerite history to the very letter, as Ellen White said we would do. Now, on these two charts, there are fundamentally three pieces of information that the church today disagrees on. And you need to be aware of these three, because there are erroneous views on these three issues. The first one that we've already spoken about is the daily. There's two views of the daily in our church today. Most of the church, 99% of it, believes that the daily, this is the word that's taken from the book of Daniel. It's found in five places in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 8, in Daniel chapter 11, and in Daniel chapter 12. This daily, most of the church believes, is Christ's ministration. He goes to heaven and he daily ministers on your behalf. But the pioneers believed that the daily was dealing with the power of paganism, either as a religious concept or as a physical nation, like pagan Rome, or the Medes and the Persians, or the Greeks. All of them were understood to be pagan powers, and when you looked at them collectively as a group, the thing that tied them all together is their religious practices and their ideology, which was essentially paganistic or paganism. So today, the information that's on these charts, which deals with the issue that the daily is paganism, is rejected. And the second piece of information that's rejected is the role of Islam. On both of these charts, you can see, it's probably easier to see on this one, that there are these two warriors on horses, and it calls them Mohammedans or Mohammedans, or these are Islamic warriors. Now there's a lot of information about these in the writings of our pioneers, and we've discussed this in a previous presentation. This is the story of Islam and how it's the first and second woe. You can see here that we wrote the second woe, which was the restraining of radical Islam, and this was a truth that the Millerites understood very clearly, and this is now being rejected. Our understanding of the trumpet powers of Revelation 8 and Revelation 9, particularly the role of Islam, is rejected in our church, and they see it as an incorrect understanding of fulfillment of prophecy. So this is a second truth that's rejected. But perhaps the most prominent or the most famous piece of information or prophecy that's on these charts that's rejected is the 2520. So if you've wondered, I don't know how many people here have got into a controversy about the 2520. The reason why it becomes such an important part of the struggle that's going on in the church at the end of the world is because history is being repeated. These charts, as they came into prophetic history, because history was going to be repeated, they were in prophetic history here, they were the foundation of the Millerite movement. They become the foundation of this movement. The truths that we teach and understand are all based upon the information that's on these charts, and it's these three things that are rejected, and the figurehead of the rejection of this message all seems to be centered around the 2520.
What is it that made the foundation between 9/11 and 2005?
There was a development of truth and understanding. Remember here we said that the message had been formalized.
Yeah.
And the message is essentially the message that Brother Tebow's given this weekend, which is the movements from 1989 to the Sunday Law. And those 6 verses describe in a lot of detail, step by step, those movements. But since those truths were understood way back here in 1996 and before this, because there was an increase of knowledge on these verses, so the truths that these 6 verses teach us were understood before 1996, long before that, but they were formalized into this booklet as I've just explained. And at that time, people who were used to study and teach this message thought that the message is all about these last 6 verses, and that's all that was really discussed for many, many years. And then when 9/11 occurred, we began to see that there was more to this message than meets the eye. Because when you see the study of Daniel 11:40-45, the role of radical Islam is not really highlighted. Now, we knew about the charts, but we didn't understand how the information on these charts was going to be used to, in a much more detailed way than we'd ever imagined, was going to be used to direct and guide this movement. But as we passed 9/11, then we began to see the role of radical Islam and what it was doing. And once you begin to realize that, then you have to turn back to the foundational material that the pioneers had established. And people went back to the 1843 chart and the 1850 chart to see what we had missed. And so the foundation of this message is the information that's given in Daniel 11 verse 40-45, which is the issue about the Sunday law. And that issue on the Sunday law is brought to view on this chart here. It's, I know you can't see it here, but it's the 3rd angel's message of Revelation 14. So that's an issue on the chart. It was a foundational piece of truth that the Millerites had understood. But perhaps the most fundamental thing is the role of Islam. Because here at 9/11, we saw that history had been repeated for the 2nd time. And now Islam was going to begin to do its work. So here the foundational truths upon which this movement that we're speaking of is established, the truths go back to the foundational truths that are on both of these charts. So we began to see that history was repeating. But we never understood the role of the 2520 with the clarity that we understood it today. Now, we knew that it existed, it was a time prophecy, but by 2005, as I explained, someone, through their personal studies, came across this series of articles in the year 1856 in the Review and Herald, where Hiram Edson was doing a study on the 2520. He was re-looking at it, re-examining it, and based upon his conclusions and the conclusions of William Miller, we saw that the 2520 was in fact a key component of the end time prophecy that we're teaching. The reason for that is that we saw here, if you take the end of these two 2520s, one goes to 1798 and one goes to 1844, you can see that. And 1798 and 1844 are the beginning and ending of this reform line. So you have 2520 here, here's 2520, and this 2520 is showing us that there's a scattering or a punishment of God's people all the way up to 1798. And then it stops. And now there's a gathering or a collecting of God's people all the way from 1798 for 46 years. And by the time you get to 1844, then you get the completion of the second 2520 here. And what that's showing is that this theme of scattering and this theme of gathering has come to its conclusion. So by the time you get to the end of 1844, God's people have been gathered. The church has been built in 46 years, ready to establish the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So bringing that into our own history, in the year 2005, we had real clarity on the issue of the 2520. And then this becomes the symbol or the figure of the foundation of this message. And so when you see the truths that are on these charts, the three things that our church wars against, as I said, is the daily, the role of Islam, and the 2520. But it's the 2520 that they've attacked ferociously. I don't know even how to explain it. People get disfellowshipped for believing the 2520. People, if you're in denominational employment, you can lose your job over this issue. It's unbelievable. The lengths that the church goes to try and suppress this. Now, why would they target the 2520? Why is it such a problematic issue? We don't have time, obviously, to go through what the 2520 symbolizes or represents. But if you go to Leviticus 26 and you read that chapter, you'll see that it's dealing with the keeping or the breaking of the covenant between the Lord and his people. And he says, if you break the covenant that I've established with you, I'm going to punish you. And the punishment that he gives them is symbolized by these 7 times. So these 7 times, or this 25-20, becomes a symbol of the punishment if you break a covenant with God. So here, as we're going through this reform line, God's church are now making a public statement, even though they don't even realize it, that they're breaking a covenant. Then they refuse to enter into covenant with their Lord, and it's based upon the rejection of the 25-20. So its acceptance or rejection has issues that relate to your salvation. They have salvific properties to them, because the rejection of this truth is going to determine which side of the line you're going to be on at the Sunday law, whether or not you're in fact going to be wise or foolish. Now, when we make bold statements like that, people become very agitated and sometimes aggressive, and it adds fuel to the fire. I appreciate that, about the significance and the importance of the 25-20. So here's this foundation that's been rejected. And as I say, people have been disfellowshipped. I don't know what the situation is here in Victoria, but I know a number of people who have been disfellowshipped over this issue in Canada and in many places in Europe. So we've now got to the year 1844, April the 19th. And when the Millerites did their calculations about the year 1843, you know, when we do calculations about our calendar, we go from the first day of the first month, or New Year's Day. New Year's Day for us is January the 1st. Yeah? We go from January the 1st to December 31st, New Year's Eve, and then the next day would be New Year's Day. Now, when the Millerites were developing their theories on these charts, they used a combination of our calendar, but they also combined it with the calendar that the Jews used. Now, if you know anything about a Jewish calendar, you know that it begins in the spring, March, April time, and not in January. They go from spring to spring, not from winter to winter. Now, the Millerites understood this, and they developed it in their thinking. So when William Miller was saying that the Lord was going to come in 1843, in his mind, he was stretching that all the way here to April 1844. So this is the year 1843. 1843 doesn't finish on December the 31st, 1843, as you and I understand. It actually stretches a few months further into the spring, and it goes into the spring or to April 1844. So when Christ didn't arrive in 1844, April the 18th, the last day, or New Year's Eve, the next day, which was New Year's Day, was April the 19th. And on April the 19th, when Christ didn't come back, all hell broke loose in the churches. They began to vigorously persecute and punish and mock and taunt the Millerites, because everything that they had preached had come to naught. Their whole message collapsed around them. Now, many of those Millerites walked away from the message, but there were many who remained, and they began to explore and try to understand why things had gone wrong. In this struggle between the Millerites and the Protestants, the Millerites began to resist this persecution that the Protestants were bringing to them, and they identified the Protestant churches as becoming part of Babylon. Remember, we spoke about the Protestant churches had escaped from Babylon, and they were free. All those people that fled from Europe went to the United States and to have religious freedom. Remember, we spoke about that, and the papers he wanted them back. Back here in the year 1844, they delivered the message of Babylon, and they identified the Protestant churches as being part of Babylon. So right here, Babylon takes back its last daughter, the Protestant churches. Now, you're familiar in Revelation 13 with this lamb-like beast that rises up out of the earth. Who do we identify that as? The United States, we know that yet. There are two beasts in Revelation 13. One comes out of the sea, the papacy, and one comes up out of the earth, the United States. And that beast that comes up out of the earth has two horns. And Ellen White says those two horns represent church and state, or Protestantism and republicanism. Now today, in 2016, as a church, what we teach is the following. If I draw these two horns here, these are the two horns of this lamb-like beast, and this represents Protestantism and republicanism, or church and state. We today teach that the fulfillment of Revelation 13, as spoken about, these two horns, which have become a symbol of this lamb-like beast, they're going to be destroyed or taken down by the papacy at the Sunday law, when the United States begins to pay homage to the beast power or the papacy. Now, I don't know if that's what you've heard in either prophetic studies or revelation seminars, or even maybe that's even what you believe. But that's what we teach as a church, that everything's being pushed into the future. Now, these two horns, as I said, are a symbol of the United States. And right here, what did the Millerites identify? The Millerites identify that on April the 19th, the Protestant churches actually become part of Babylon. So this horn here of Protestant America, which we're predicting is going to fall at the Sunday law, actually fell over 170 years ago. So this event here actually occurred right here, when the Protestant churches fell in the United States on April the 19th, 1844, when the arrival of the second angel came, and they said that Babylon has fallen. This is the churches in the United States. They fell 170 years ago. Now, we should really think about that when you think about your understanding of prophecy. We're looking for an event to occur here, and we're looking totally in the wrong direction. We should be looking at an event that happened, I don't know how many generations back 170 years is, but it's a lot of generations. This is before Adventism even started. Before Adventism even started, the Protestant churches of the United States had already become harlots, had already gone back to their mother. Long before any of us, or our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were born. And yet the church today is still looking forward to that event as a sign that Christ is about to appear. So you can see why we're in such great trouble today, because we're looking for signs that are way back in history, and the church has got no idea of how to locate itself, prophetically speaking, of where we are. We are literally a boat in a sea with no map and no compass. We're lost without any direction, and there is really no solution to this problem. Not only is it prophesied that this church is going to be destroyed, but there's no solution because people refuse to listen. It happened way back here. Over 11 years ago, the church began to war and fight against this message. And you know, when human pride rises up, you've had this experience. How hard is it to humble yourself and say, I've made a mistake, and to backtrack? It's extremely difficult, especially when you're someone in authority. You know, if you're a pastor or an elder, to go before your congregation and say, by the way, I've made a mistake. Not just a little mistake, this is a systemic mistake.
He'd lose his job if he said it.
He loses his job anyway, of course. That is a big incentive not to do anything. But just human pride makes it very hard for people to step back and say, everything that I've taught is all wrong. If I were to say to you, many lay people find this a struggle. They say, how can we have understood things so incorrectly, understood all of this error for so long? How can this be? And it's a great resistance to accepting this message. So the thing that we want to see here is that one of these horns that fell, and we're expected to fall at Sunday law, fell over 172 years ago, today and counting. What about this second horn? Now surely this second horn is going to fall at the Sunday law, when the government is going to succumb to the pressures of the papacy. And my brother's resigning said, he says no, yeah, he's already got the idea that this horn here fell a long time ago. It fell over a decade ago. So every sign that you are looking for, you being the church member, that the Sunday law is about to happen, that these events are going to be fulfilled, are already in the past. Remember we spoke about what prophecy is? The first thing, if you want to understand prophecy, you need to look in the past. And if you refuse to do that, you have no help, no clue of how to progress into the future. So we're going to quickly jump over these two dates, and we're not going to discuss too much about 1844, October 22nd, because most of us are familiar with that date.
Excuse me, can I ask what happened in 2005?
So in 2005, a brother on this who was studying this message came across a series of articles that were written by Hiram Edson. And so it's only marking a date when we began to understand with clarity the 2520. So 2005 is really connected to when the 2520 became a component of the messages that we teach, and people began to resist against this with a severity that is shocking. I mean, it's just a number on a chart. It's just a date with, you know, a BC date and an AD date, and people get disfellowshipped over believing this thing.
We're paralleling it, with May and June
Yes.
1942. So is that the time period when the leadership was approached with these messages as well?
Oh, if you remember back here in Millerite history, the leadership of the Protestant churches, they understood about this message way back before this. Because remember, in 1833, they give William Miller his license to preach. So they're familiar with the message right back from the very beginning. And they're extremely happy with the events that are going on. But as things progress, they begin to get alarm bells. Because instead of people turning to the leaders for advice, for counsel, for support, they begin to turn to the people who are delivering this end-time message, the Millerites, William Miller and his associates, and they begin to look for them for help and support. And you know, the people who help you, you tend to support, not only with your prayers, not only emotionally, but also with your finances. And so they began to support these people, and the church leadership are not going to tolerate that kind of behavior. And so when they had the number on this chart this year, 1843, this was the pretext for them to put a stop to this movement, because it was getting out of hand. So I'm not suggesting that the church or the leadership in our church begin to understand the events back in 2005. They're well aware of these things way back here in the very early days. Many of the leaders were studied with, consulted with. It was brought to their attention the truths that were being spoken of long before 2005. But in 2005, the 2520 began to rear its, if I can put it this way, rear its ugly head in the church, and it becomes the symbol of the resistance to accept this message. I don't know if that hopefully answers your question. So we're going to look at, again, I say these two dates. We're not going to address July 21st because we're running out of time. You're all familiar with Matthew 25. Mm-hmm. This is the midnight cry. It says at midnight there was a cry made. And this cry in the Millerite history was the statement that, behold, Jesus is about to return on October the 22nd, 1844. And I've explained that they lost direction here. They got into a real serious fight with the Protestant churches, and they separated from them. There was a separation here. The Millerites said that the Protestant churches had become part of Babylon. They were now lost, and they started warring in a serious way against the leadership of the Protestant churches. They became enemies. More people began to be disfellowshipped. The problem just escalated from here onward. Now, this is the first angel's message here, and this is the second angel's message here. And we can see they're separated by 4 years in this history. And we've also identified here at 9/11, we've seen the parallel, how this is also the first angel's message at 9/11, and I've explained the parallels between them. Now, we know that 9/11 is the fall of the Twin Towers, or the destruction of the great buildings in New York. They were the tallest buildings in New York. Now, Ellen White has a number of things to say about this event, and perhaps the most important one, there are two important passages. One of them is taken from Testimonies to the Church, and it's actually found in volume 9 of the Testimonies, and it begins in a section of that book which begins on page 11. Now, so we have 9 Testimonies, page 11. Now, that is not a coincidence when it talks about the burning or the destruction of the buildings in New York. This coding that's embedded in Scripture and in Ellen White's writings happens so many times. You have to be blind, deliberately blind, not to see it or not to accept it. We can go to a passage where I'm only going to paraphrase it now because of lack of time. It's found in Live Sketches, page 411. Now, in Live Sketches 411, please take the note of that and study it for yourselves afterwards. Ellen White says that when the great buildings of New York are going to be destroyed, and she tells you who destroys these buildings, she says when the Lord is going to arise and he's going to shake terribly the earth, she says then prophecy is going to be fulfilled, and she tells you the very prophecy that will be fulfilled at that time. And she quotes Revelation chapter 18 verses 1 to 3. She says when the buildings of New York are brought down, then Revelation chapter 18 verses 1 to 3 will be fulfilled. Now, we've already mentioned Revelation 18 verses 1 to 3, but let's quickly go there. I know we don't have much time, but I want us to see this point. Revelation 18 verses 1 to 3. Verse 1 says, "And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory." Now, when it uses this phrase, the earth was lightened with its glory, Ellen White refers to this phrase repeatedly in her writings, and she identifies this as being the first angel's message. So the first angel's message is Revelation 18 verse 1. So here we have the first angel's message, Revelation 18 verse 1, being fulfilled here at 9/11 in agreement with the spirit of prophecy. But if you read carefully, in verse 2, it says, "and he." Can we see that in verse 2? It says, "and he." Who would that he be?
Jesus.
That he would be the same angel that's in verse 1. So you can see the angel that comes down in verse 1 is the same angel that speaks in verse 2. And verse 1 was the first angel, so here's this first angel. But what does verse 2 say? It says, Babylon is fallen. So what message is that? That's the second angel's message. But who's giving that message? It's the first angel. So you can see at 9/11, Ellen White says, Revelation 18 verses 1, 2 and 3 are all fulfilled at the same time, because the angel that comes down at 9/11, which is this first angel, is not only going to be the first angel, but when he comes down, he's going to give the second angel's message at the very same time. It's a singular angel. And then in verse 4, verse 3 just gives some further information. Verse 4 says, "And I heard another voice." So this is a separate angel that's now giving the information in verse 4, and this angel says, "Come out of her, my people." This is the loud cry that we're all familiar with. So right back down here, this is Revelation 18 verse 4. Here's Revelation 18 verse 4, when God's people give the loud cry to those people in Babylon and say, "Come out of her, come out of Babylon, my people." Revelation 18 verse 4 is the Sunday law. But before that, you have Revelation 18 verse 1 at 9/11, and I've explained the logic behind that. But when he comes down, at that very moment that he comes down, he cries, Babylon is fallen. He brings two messages with him, the first and second angel's messages. So when we bring this event down here at 9/11, this history here of April the 19th, 1844 is not going to get taken down here as a separate waymark. It actually gets brought down here, and it begins to be combined with 9/11. So the events of Millerite history at this waymark and this waymark, the first and second angel's messages, combine together in our history. And so we have a combination of the first and the second angel's message. Now at first that takes a bit of getting used to, how you can combine these messages together, but it's from an understanding of this statement from Life Sketches 4:11 and also a careful reading of Revelation 18 verses 1 and 2. And when you begin to see that carefully, you'll see that what's being portrayed here is actually what's happening. These two messages combine to a singular message at 9/11. And that's really important for us to understand, because here you can see that the first horn of the United States fell, the horn of Protestant America fell at April the 19th, 1844, the second angel's message. But I've already explained before that when in Revelation 18 it says Babylon is fallen, that fall of Babylon isn't going to be happening here at the Sunday law. It begins a long time before. And we've marked the second angel here. And now what would that identification be of the fall of Babylon? It's the second horn of the United States. This is republicanism. So the two horns, the horn of Protestant America and the horn of the Republic of the United States, both fell. One fell 172 years ago and one fell 15 years ago. And the church are oblivious to these facts, and we're still looking forward to these things. So you can see clearly that the United States fell at 9/11. Now there are a number of other truths that we could bring in to defend and to develop this argument, but it suffices at this level to show you, almost just to whet your appetite if you like, just at that level, that the things that you're expecting, the fall of the United States, we're expecting as a future event. In fact, if you ask most people in the church and say, when's the Sunday law going to happen? They'll say, maybe tomorrow. I mean, people actually have, it's almost incredulous to believe people think the Sunday law could happen tomorrow. You know, you wake up tomorrow and suddenly there's a Sunday law. You know, it stretches from that foolishness to say, oh, maybe it will be when we die and our grandchildren or our children rise up and stand in the church. So we could be anywhere from tomorrow to 100 years in the future, because we don't have any direction, prophetically speaking, of when these events are going to happen, because we've closed our eyes to the truth. We don't understand how prophecy works. And the events which we're expecting, the fulfillment of Revelation 13, they've already begun to occur. One of them back here and one of them back here. Now these are all prefiguring the final events. I understand that. But we need to realize that the events that we've seen occurring in the world have been the fulfillment of prophetic events. Islam attacking the Twin Towers at 9/11 was a prophetic event. The fall of Protestant America and Republic America occurred in these two dates when the second angel's message arrived. 1989, the fall of communism, the destruction of the Berlin Wall, were all prophetic waymarks. What we're expecting soon is this event here. I'll line it up here so we can see it. This is the midnight cry. And in closing, what I'd like to say is this. Remember yesterday we spoke in the question and answer session about Balaam. We identified that Balaam becomes a symbol of the United States in its interaction with what power? With the donkey or the ass, which is a symbol of Islam. And if you don't accept the truths on these charts, you can never see this. If you don't understand how stories can be figures of real life prophetic events, you have no clue, no idea of what any of these stories mean. I mean, what does the story of Balaam mean to anybody in the 21st century? An Adventist, I mean. It means nothing. It's an old story that happened 3,000 plus years ago, which has no relevance to us, unless you begin to see that story as a prophetic parable that's teaching you deep spiritual truth about the end of the world, which I believe it is. And that first interaction between that man and that animal occurred at 9/11, when the animal got taken out of the way and Balaam got distracted from his...
Just explain what event caused the worm to fall event.
So my brothers asked me to explain what was the fall at 9/11. So our primary argument is that the second angel's message arrived, and it's identifying that Babylon begins to fall here. And if you look at the historical events that are occurring here at 9/11, you have to see how it parallels the events here on April the 19th, 1844. So here, this church that had escaped from the clutches of the papacy, Protestant America, this daughter of Catholicism, was recaptured. And she was groomed. We all understand about grooming. I don't know if you use that phrase here. She was groomed for 160 years or so, all the way down here, ready to enter into a relationship with the state. So there's a church-state relationship that's being addressed here. So that's one issue about how this horn falls at 9/11. But if you look at the interaction between the papacy and the United States at 9/11, you begin to see that the United States, after its interaction with between Ronald Reagan and John Paul II from 1980s into 1989 up to 9/11, we, the United States, became closer and closer to the papacy. So maybe I could give you one Bible verse to explain this. Let's go to Psalms chapter 48. Before I explain Psalms 48, let me just finish the point here, then we'll close with the discussion on Psalms 48, which is dealing with this issue here of 9/11. So at 9/11, Balaam is riding his ass and he gets taken out the way. Then he brings him back on track, and then he continues to ride to come and destroy God's people. And there at the midnight cry, there's the second interaction where Balaam crushes his foot against the wall. I've explained what that wall is. A wall is a law, and there's a law which is going to create the image of the beast. This is the statue of Daniel chapter 3, the statue of gold, the statue of Babylon, that was an image of Nebuchadnezzar. There's an interaction here between the United States and Islam, and when this attack happens, and by the way, we're here, 2016, we are very close to the midnight cry. Extremely close, closer than we could really realize. And we really need to prepare for that event. I've already described the fact how the economy, not only of the United States, but of every nation in the world, is going to collapse here. It's going to be crushed. The economy will be crushed. And we need to make preparation before that event, because once that event happens, the value of the dollar is going to drop and things will be very expensive. You just try and sell things, it's going to be extremely hard, because no one's going to be able to afford things. People are going to lose their jobs.
I was wondering about last June, when the homosexual act was made for the whole United States.
Now you can,
does that have any...
You can see that within weeks of the issue between the relationship between a man and a woman, which is what that issue is about, was being addressed in the United States, there was a similar issue being addressed in our church at the General Conference session, where the role of a man and a woman was voted upon. Now, we're talking about the ordination of women. Now, we think that that issue was resolved because it got voted down, but there are many intricacies about that ruling that we should be really concerned about. And the primary one is this. I don't have time to address the issue of 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union. You know, it's called a Soviet Union because it parallels the Union of the United States. You know, the United States is not a singular country, really. It's a number of countries that have come together under the umbrella of a federal system, because you have states that join together to have to come under a federation. And if you look at that structure, it's virtually identical to the structure of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was brought down in 1989. And what was actually brought down was not the individual countries that were destroyed, but it was the Union. The Union, or the gluing of these nations, was broken up or fragmented. And that is going to be repeated at the end of the world, particularly at Sunday Law. The union that exists in the United States is going to be destroyed. The United States, that union is going to be fragmented and things are going to collapse. The federal system is going to usurp its authority. Now, there are differences between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the main difference is this. In the United States, the thing that keeps that union strong is the weakness of the federal government, because the individual states are supposed to determine their own future. So if you know anything about the US governmental system, you know that that's what keeps America strong, the weakness of the federal system and the strength of the individual states. But you can see, step by step, the federal system is taking control of the individual states. And it came to a head last year when the Supreme Court issued a ruling that says that they have authority over the individual states about self-determination. So here you have the federal government usurping its authority over the states, which it is not allowed to do. It's an unconstitutional thing that's occurring. Now, at the same time, the same thing is happening in our church. In the year 1901 up to 1903, Ellen White said that the structure of our conference system, the general conference structure, was no longer fit for purpose, and that we now had a king that was ruling over Adventism. And she said that king needs to be dethroned and the whole structure needs to be broken up. And she set in place the system where the general conference would be weak and the unions and the divisions would determine their own future.
That was in 1901.
Yeah, this was the controversy between 1901 and 1903.
No, I'm just saying that, and that's repeating now.
Yes, and so what you see happening now is that the General Conference is not going to ever do that. It's never going to relinquish its power, and it's centralizing that power and not letting the unions and the divisions self-determine their future, even if that future is wrong. So for the very fact that we have a vote about women's ordination at a General Conference level is fundamentally unconstitutional, because that decision should have been made by the unions and divisions by themselves, even if you didn't like the answer. Even if the North American division said that we're going to have women pastors, they had the authority and the right to make that decision without it being escalated to the General Conference, and for the General Conference to decide. So you can see that the issue of women's ordination that happened at the same time as the issue of same-sex marriage were parallel events, one in the church and one outside of the church. There's much more that we could say about that event, because it was a judicial act that was being enforced almost as law. And when Ellen White and A.T. Jones comments on this issue of the progression of the image of the beast, he says first it will be a judicial act, and then it will be an act of government. First a judicial, then a legislative act. These two steps. And the first step has already begun. The issue of marriage, or the image of the beast, is already at the Supreme Court level, or the judiciary. It's now all that needs to be happening. It's going to be put into law. So we're here, and at the midnight cry, the economy of the world is going to collapse, and it's only going to get worse after the Sunday law. So just coming here at 9:11 in closing, I know I'm way over time. We're in Psalms 48. Psalms 48, we'll read up to verse 7, then we'll make comment. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in the mountain of his holiness. Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. God is known in her palaces for a refuge. For lo, the kings were assembled, they passed by together. They saw it, and so they marveled. They were troubled and hasted away. Fear took hold upon them there, and pain as a woman in travail. Thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind. Now there's a lot of symbology in this passage that we haven't addressed, but the first 3 verses is talking about Jerusalem, the city of our God. And this is a symbol of the church. This is a symbol of the church at 9/11. Here we are at 9/11, and the church looks beautiful. Verse 4, it says, the kings were assembled and they passed by together. These kings, you can see in the plural, are all on the same path with the same objective. They're all come together. All the kings have come together. Now, if you look at where that happens, you find that this is dealing with Revelation 17. Revelation 17 talks about 10 kings that come together and give their kingdom to the woman or the whore for 1 hour, or the beast, it actually says in Revelation 17. So that coming together of these kings of Revelation 17 is brought to view in Psalms 48. But in Revelation 17, it talks about the kings being assembled here at the Sunday law. But Psalms 48 is identifying 9/11. The kings have already come together, and one of those kings that have come together is the United States. The United States has come together in union with all the other kings of the earth. This is a one world government. The one world government has been established and already started and wanted to do something at 9/11. They wanted to do, and let's see what they want to do. It says, for lo, the kings were assembled and they passed by together. They passed by our church. They saw it, Jerusalem, the Seventh-day Adventist church, and they marveled. And the reason they marveled is because they saw the beauty of this church and they wanted to have us. Remember this story about fornication and churches coming into a relationship of whoredom with the state? This is what's happening here. These men want to go into a relationship with the church. This is the issue of church and state. They want to draw this church and bring it down. Verse 4. They passed by together. Verse 5. They saw it, and lo, they marveled, but they were troubled and hasted away. Just at the very moment when the United States wanted to come and destroy this church, because they'd already assembled in a one world government at 9/11, they were troubled. And what troubled the United States at 9/11? Radical Islam. Radical Islam took them off their path. Remember Balaam, he's on a trajectory to come and attack God's people, to curse it, and now this ass is going to take him in a different direction. He goes off the path. This is what's being brought to view in Psalms 48. Verse 6, fear took hold upon them. Fear took hold upon the United States, but not only the United States, all the nations of the world. They become angry with Radical Islam, and they want to deal with Radical Islam, which is what we spoke about, Revelation 11 verse 18. And pain as of a woman in travail. A woman in travail is a woman in pregnancy. But not only pregnancy, she's at the end of pregnancy. Now she's in labour pains. Travail is labour pain. How do labour pains work? You get a contraction, and then what happens? It relaxes. Then you get a second contraction, and the second contraction is harder. So these are the contraction pains. The first contraction is at 9/11. Then there's a relief. The second contraction is at the midnight cry, and there's a relief. And there's going to be 3 contractions. The third contraction is going to be at the Sunderland. This last one is going to produce a baby. And this baby that's going to be produced, Ellen White calls it the child of the papacy. And what is the child of the papacy? Nothing more than Sunday law. So you can see the imagery that's being brought to view in the Bible is in agreement with what you and I understand from the spirit of prophecy. It says, fear took hold upon them there as pain as of a woman in travail. It says, thou breakest the ships of Tarshish. Brother Tabo already mentioned about ships. Ships are a symbol of economy, or the commerce. And Tarshish is a symbol of the United States. The United States economy got broken when the kings were assembled here at 9/11. And what broke it? An east wind. Not only is Islam represented or symbolized by an ass, it's also symbolized by an east wind. They're the people of the east. So at 9/11, when the kings were assembled and they all came into a union together, the United States surrenders its sovereignty, becomes a one world government. And when those kings are assembled, the purpose of that assembling is because they want to pay homage to the papacy. That's why the United States horn, republicanism, fell at 9/11. They want to destroy God's people, but they're restrained from doing so by the activities of Islam. And my time is up.
I just want to ask that when a church member, you know, like we're saying, is present this to them, when a church member says, I know the church is wrong, but we still have to stay with the ship, is there anything that you can do beyond that?
We're required, according to Ezekiel chapter 2 and chapter 3, if you read those two chapters, we're required to give a message to this church. And the message we're required to give them is the messages that I've given. It's not just to say the church is in a bad place, let's carry on life as normal. You know, business as normal carries on even though we're protesting against the church, we're sighing and crying. We need to deliver to them a message that the end of the world is coming and they need to repent and change their ways. And this is a very specific message. It's a message that in 1989, a reform movement began. 9/11, this church entered into a period of being sealed, and now the wheat and the tares are going to separate. And the culmination of this message is that this church is going to be destroyed. The Lord is going to send the Babylonian Empire to come and destroy this church. And this is the message that we're supposed to give to God's people. Not shy away from that, not to be fearful of the consequences of that message. And when you give that message in connecting with all the components, for instance, the work of the daily, Islam and 2520, you'll see you'll get into real hot water really quick. And you may end up getting disfellowshipped. But I need to close. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and your mercy, your loving watch care over us, as we consider the great truths that you're teaching your people. The question that we ask ourselves individually and also as a group, what do we do with these truths? What do they mean to us? Father, first and foremost, we need to make a personal preparation that we might understand how we are to get ready in the final moments of Earth's history. We need to speak to our spouses, our children, our parents, so that we might help them to prepare also. And Father, then we need to turn to our brothers and sisters and also the leaders in this church, many of whom are being blinded and are being constrained and restrained from understanding and teaching what is truth. Help us, Lord, to be a light, not to the Gentiles at this moment, Lord, but a light to your people, so that we may be able to help them and guide them and direct them. Lord, we need to give a message that both is a cheering message, Lord, that you're going to save your people, but it's also a message of condemnation, that if those who reject these truths will be lost. Help us to have the courage, the fortitude and the strength, that we might develop the character that we'd be able to stand up when we are persecuted and we are mistreated and abused. Please be with us and please bless us, we pray and ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.